Poland is doubtless at the forefront of the collective West's rivalry with Russia and other countries in the cyber domain. Hybrid warfare has invariably been a challenge for the Polish armed forces, the intelligence community, and the entire society. Cooperation with the United States in this sphere is essential and indispensable. Both our countries possess extraordinary knowledge and enviable expertise as regards Russia's nefarious activities in this specific area. Defending our democracies in light of Russia's brazen interference in the Western political systems and preserving freedom of speech should be our common goal.
Now we are flying to Krakow. Polish Krakow, in English it's Krakow, and in Krakow is Izabela Albrecht. Izabela, are you with us?
I'm with you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I do hear you well. Welcome,
Thank
Izabela Albrecht.
It's renowned from Krakow.
Yeah, hello. Dobry wieczór.
Dobry wieczór.
Izabela is a renowned expert on cybersecurity. Now is the director of the Cybersecurity Center and Rector's Proxy for Krakow Diana Accelerator at AGH University of Krakow. Izabela, thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Igor, and thank you for the invitation. And let me just start by saying and sending my congratulations to you, as well as Ambassador Marek Magierowski, as well as all individuals involved in the launch of the Warsaw Freedom Institute office on the other side of the Atlantic. As you know, I'm not an active think tanker now, but I have a think tanker soul, so I really do appreciate all your efforts, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed for all successes in terms of project that will support transatlantic relations run by the Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, we now welcome Major General Karol Molenda, the living legend of Polish cyber defense, commander of the Polish Cyber Defense Forces, with a message and an answer to the question: how have the transatlantic relations between Poland and the US impacted the development of Poland's cyber army? And what does this partnership look like today? How does it work on a daily basis, as well as what can be done together within a bilateral framework to tackle cyber threats, which are truly on the rise, as a vital part of hybrid warfare and hybrid tactics, which we will also explore later today with Dr. David Edelman. So over to you, General.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and allies, it's an honor to contribute to this distinguished forum, bringing together some of the sharpest minds in security, diplomacy, and technology from both Poland and the United States. Thank you to the Warsaw Freedom Institute and all the organizers for creating this platform for dialogue in a time when transatlantic unity is more essential than ever. I have to say that throughout my military career, the relationship between Poland and the United States has been more than just visible. It's been vital. It shaped how we train, how we think, and ultimately how we fight in this complex 21st century threat landscape. What is more, our success in building the Polish Cyber Defense Forces, what you may know as Wojska Obrony Cyberprzestrzeni, would not have been possible without American partnership. Our capabilities were not built in isolation. They were forged together through joint exercises, shared intelligence, and common purpose. And what is most important, through a shared mindset, mission-driven, forward-leaning, and anchored in trust. Of course, we can also try to deepen our cooperation between US and Poland, especially in the field of hybrid deterrence. And how to do it? The answer is simple. We stop trying to work in parallel, and we should start working as one force. The hybrid threat landscape doesn't wait. It doesn't respect borders, budgets, and bureaucracies. That means we must act together and preemptively, not just reactively. Let me suggest 3 ideas. First of all, we should think about creating joint hybrid task forces with a dual mandate, combining cyber operations and information warfare under a single command structure for exercise and contingency operations. Second, aligned our doctrines and playbooks. NATO is doing important work, but we need bilateral depth, especially when facing Russian tactics that mix APTs, ransomware, and disinformation in a single campaign. Third, embedded trust, not just in strategy, but in code. Through interoperable cyber toolkits, shared AI threat models, and real-time data exchange platforms. Our cooperation must reflect the reality that today's hybrid battlefield is algorithmic, persistent, and political. And I will add one final point. Deterrence isn't just about showing strength. It's about building speed and trust faster that the adversary can sow doubt and disruption. Of course, we should also focus on critical infrastructure. And I will be blunt. We need to stop thinking of civilian infrastructure as other people's problem. In the hybrid world, the power grid is a front line. The telecom hub is a target. The shipping manifest is intelligence. That's why civil-military cooperation must be treated as a strategic function. We know that civilian infrastructure is often more innovative than military platforms, but it is also more vulnerable, not hardened, not segmented, and often not ready for sustained attacks. So here's what we need. We need cyber resilience assessment, jointly conducted by military and civilian experts. We also need cyber situational awareness, spanning both civilian and defense systems. One map, not two. And yes, in some cases, direct military engagement via defense cyber operations or rapid reaction teams, when civilian capabilities are overwhelmed. This is especially critical as we see increase in use of dual-use technologies like cloud platforms, satellite terminals, and drones. These are opportunities, but also high-value hybrid targets. Of course, there is also a way to improve our answer and there is also a need to counter Russian disinformation campaigns. Here's what you call a cyber attack that doesn't trip an alarm. A tweet. Let's face it, disinformation is a form of warfare. It's digital, it's viral, and yes, it's sometimes dressed up as a meme. To fight it, we need a combined strategy. For example, joint disinformation task forces with linguists, analytics, and cyber operations working side by side. We can use AI to detect deepfakes, track the narrative spread, and even predict which social fractures are being exploited. And we should launch content influence campaigns that are proactive, not just fact-checking, but truth-telling with strategic intent. And one more thing, we must move from need-to-know culture to need-to-share posture when it comes to threat intelligence. That shift alone could dramatically increase our agility. Let's remember, wars can move people faster than tanks. So let's treat information space with seriousness it deserves. No longer we operate in a strategic environment where it is the big who eats the small, but rather where the fast eats the slow. We should also think about civilian-military synergy. You can see that the line between civilian and military infrastructure has disappeared, and so the line between war and peace. That's why civilian-military cooperation is no longer optional, it is essential. Of course, we as a military, we must also understand dependencies of civilian systems. We must support civilian resilience through assessment and advisory roles, and provide early warnings on threats that move faster than legislation. At the same time, civilian sector must be ready to engage with openness, speed, and realism. Now, let me share a small anecdote to close. Yes, during a joint US-Polish cyber exercise, an American officer said to me, you Poles always expect something to go wrong. I smiled and replied, that's not pessimism, it's planning. Because for us, threat perception isn't paranoia. It is the product of over 1,000 years of history, 200 years of partitions, and just enough victories to keep us hopeful. Ladies and gentlemen, hybrid warfare has blurred the lines between peace and war, soldier and civilian, offense and defense. But it has also made one thing very clear. We are strong when we act as one. Cyber deterrence, civilian military synergy, and information defense are not Polish challenges or not American challenges. They are shared responsibilities of modern democracies. So let's build not just a partnership, but a hybrid alliance, rooted in trust, powered by innovation, and ready to defend what matters the most: freedom, truth, and resilience. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, General. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the line between war and peace, as General said, has disappeared because of the hybrid tactics. And very recently, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte referred to hybrid threats making its inroads deep into European territory and networks by saying that we are not at war, but we are not at peace either. So we will talk at this fireside chat about this hybrid tactics that have been deployed under the threshold of military conflict against the West in cognitive and social domains, in cyberspace, in the physical realm, in the form of attacks on our critical infrastructure or migration pressure on our borders, the example of an attack on the Polish-Belarusian border. But first, we will talk about the lessons from the hybrid warfare that has been deployed by Russia in Ukraine since 2022 and has reshaped modern defense thinking, which combines conventional as well as unconventional instruments of power, which is performed and supported by all operational domains, with a full range of cyber destructive acts, disinformation, espionage, and influence operations. And since we are heading toward even more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous time with new innovative threats accelerated by emerging and disruptive technologies evolving in front of our eyes, it's always good to talk with such distinguished and forward-looking experts like Dr. David Edelman, Director of the Project on Technology, Economy and National Security at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and former Special Assistant to the President Barack Obama for Economic and Technology Policy on the National Economic Council. I encourage you also to read David's full bio on the conference website. David, welcome to our fireside chat.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you. I will start with the question, what does Russia's hybrid warfare toolkit deployed in Ukraine consist of across both military and non-military means? And which internal Ukrainian vulnerabilities has it exploited and intensified? And as General suggested, let's plan for the future. So what lessons can we draw from this approach regarding Russia's potential future warfare strategy, possibly directed against the West?
Sure, and thank you again. I just want to take a moment and also congratulate the Institute on this really momentous launch to our friend Marek, who we miss here in Washington, D.C. On the congratulations on it, and Igor for launching this important initiative. So thank you for having me. You just heard the answers to some of those questions from the Major General. And when it comes to this playbook that we're seeing take place, I think it's important to recognize what is new here, but also for those of us that have been looking at cyber attacks, cyber warfare, and emerging technologies for 10, 15 or more years, what isn't new? Let's start with what was expected, right? We have elements of cyber sabotage that I think most of us can recognize are going to be a part of essentially any major conflict going forward. And so it shouldn't have been a surprise. Obviously, it was more than unfortunate, but that Russia decided to deploy the full measure of destructive cyber tools within their capabilities in theater, in conflict, in Ukraine. Right, and this is consistent with activities that I think you've seen militaries around the globe using as they're engaged in what has now been described as hybrid warfare here. But really, we're talking about concretely tools, hacking tools that wipe servers, hacking tools that block, deny access to government services, deny access to the government's ability to get messages out back to the people. Now, this is something that when it comes to Russian tradecraft, of course, has gone back with a very long history. I mean, those of us can go back and look as far as the attacks on Estonia in 2007, largely regarded as the first cyber attack of its kind of this era. That's a long time ago. And yet in many ways, I think we saw what happened in Estonia as a limited rehearsal for what could take place in a full-blown conflict here. And so I think it's important to recognize that cyber-specific component. It did take place. I'm going to come back to that because I think there were some surprises in terms of how we can think about it going forward for what didn't happen. But it's important to recognize the other elements of these digitally enabled attacks, right? We had conventional electronic warfare that we'd expect, right? GPS jamming that you've heard about, Starlink jamming, physical attacks on electronic facilities. No surprise here, but again, this is an important part of the playbook as more and more of particularly asymmetric warfare becomes digitally mediated, becomes critically determined, particularly in the velocity of battle, by the ability to communicate with assets, and increasingly, as those assets are themselves digital and increasingly autonomous. Right. And so another piece that you saw, and we don't go too much into necessarily in this panel, but I know has been discussed at length, is the extent to which when you have drone warfare, which has now come fully of age, where you have things like loitering munitions and others, the idea that some of these airborne assets are going to be identifying targets largely autonomously because you're in what we'd refer to as a fully denied or a largely denied electromagnetic environment, which basically means you can't send signals to the drones because you can't get messages to them. And so as a result, they need to be much better at targeting on their own. This is something I think those of us focused on, military affairs, focused on the revolution and evolution of military affairs, again, is not surprising. And yet, I think for most that are thinking broadly about security and the average American, the average civilian out there that isn't necessarily thinking and reading every day about this conflict, the fact that there are now functionally fully autonomous lethal weapons systems in theater in the Ukraine that are being deployed by both sides here is a meaningful development in the trajectory and future of warfare. And we have to take a moment to recognize that and its implications, necessary in some context for the defense of the Ukraine, but more broadly significant for how we think about questions of international law, how we think about escalation, how we think about control of escalation, and how we think about the aftermath of warfare and what we would like war to be regulated by. I think the last piece that is important to recognize here, and we can spend some time talking about it, but is important, but on some level ancillary to the military side of the conflict, is this notion of, as the Major General said, information warfare. I tend to prefer the phrase misinformation, which is not quite the same thing, but obviously there is a theater of battle that's taking place of sorts, and that is in hearts and minds and the ability of people to get unbiased information. And obviously, Russia has for decades. I remember negotiations going back 20 plus years at the United Nations over the distinction of whether information warfare was in any way distinctive from conventional military. Russian doctrine does not see much of a distinction here, neither does Chinese doctrine, incidentally. So the idea that you would be seeking to influence publics as a means to gain military advantage is very much part of the Russian doctrine, always has been. And so the idea that everything from a combination of the deep fakes of the fake surrender of Zelensky that we saw in 22, the mass disinformation bots that you've seen Russians amplify on TikTok, the phishing, hack, and leak that you've seen go over and over targeting NATO and other allied partners, all of those are tactics that can be expected in the context of this broader information warfare push. But I do think we also need to be careful as we think about where these lines are between peacetime and wartime coercion. There is no question that episodes like this are going to feature into future military conflicts. They are, they will be unavoidable, I would argue. And yet at the same time, we also have to recognize that not every incursion into what the Russians might call information space, what we might call information warfare type attacks in the context of this conflict, or we might even just say misinformation or propaganda, not every one of those constitutes an attack as our military should think about it. And one of the things that the U.S. doctrine has struggled with for many years is how to come to an appropriate division between the civil and military applications of these kinds of concerns when U.S. adversaries do not necessarily view this distinction. And yet it needs to be part of our broader consideration. So you asked the question, Isabella, where do we go from here? What are the kind of the lessons we can take from it? Obviously, many are, I just mentioned, of the what was expected, what wasn't. Some other pieces that I think we need to take away as lessons, though, it is notable, and I think surprising to many commentators in space, that Russia has not succeeded in a broad-based information attack. What I mean specifically is a cyber attack, a digital attack against critical information infrastructure outside of the theater of battle. It is surprising to many analysts, I think you've heard this around from others, that there has not been major attacks on NATO systems that have been successful in the civilian context, trying to, for instance, rerun the blackouts that you saw in rehearsals up to this particular conflict, you obviously saw in the prior one as well. Those sorts of activities, which one could argue may well have been plausibly part of the Russian playbook, have not been implemented. Now, it is a matter of debate whether that is a function of deterrence or if that is a function of a lack of capability. That is still open. We will not know for some time what the definitive answer is. It is clear that there has been significant, important messaging from the US across multiple administrations, from NATO allies, and importantly from the European continent itself about what those sorts of attacks might trigger. I think importantly, you've seen an evolution in the last several years of the US being much more willing to point fingers at, to quickly attribute, to publicly identify, and to articulate that there will be consequences out of band, so not cyber on cyber, but hybrid deterrence, so to speak, outside of that band, at the time and place of choosing in response to these sorts of attacks, even if they happen in what would seem to be outside the theater of battle. That's a really important distinction. I think the other important distinction that we need to remember, the other key takeaway here, is just how important companies have been in the telling of the story of what is otherwise a very military conflict. I talk about this a lot in my book, Rethinking Cyber Warfare, about how one of the key actors that I think was not really contemplated in quite the same way 20 years ago, but that is really central to the evolution of this space as we think literally about how do countries fight wars in this space, how do they defend themselves against attackers, are the companies. And there's some very specific, they almost look like business deals that took place at the beginning, before this conflict, in the early days of it, that have been important to the Ukraine's cyber defense. What do I mean? Well, specifically, particular acts of legislation and commercial deals that, for instance, allowed certain critical Ukrainian government data to be housed outside of the Ukraine. Now, remember, that's actually cutting across the currents of the moment. Right now, you've got European jurisdictions left and right claiming the essentiality of data localization. We have to have European cloud. We have to have data resident within a country. It's a matter of major trade debate, whether that makes sense. It's certainly a major matter of technical debate, whether it makes any sense. But as we start to think, as the Major General implored us to, about defense in depth and how we think about different layers of defense, it is important to recognize that data localization denies us the opportunity for geo-decentralized defense in depth. It insists that there be single points of failure of that data, which is to say, within that information physical space. And so the ability of Ukrainian authorities to move data off, to invite foreign companies, whether it's the Microsofts, the CrowdStrikes of the world, or others, to come in and literally defend those systems, and then to work collaboratively and internationally, because it may well be the case, as we've seen in other instances, where the first indications of pending cyber capabilities or attacks are coming from afar. They're not happening in theater, and they're not necessarily happening from the adversaries you'd expect, but the ability to have a globally activated defense network where you're able to share those signatures across authorities like the Major General was talking about, these kinds of very active technical collaborations among operators, that's what can lead to proactive defense that may well have been part of why the Russians had only been partly successful in these information campaigns here. And so I think it's really critical that we think about and be strategic about having a really honest conversation about the ways in which the dynamic between not just civilian and military, but between private companies and military and private companies and defense looks very different in the cyberspace and in an age of cyber conflict than it did even 5 or 10 years ago before this invasion of the Ukraine.
Right. Thank you very much. I have some question from the audience, if I may make this follow up with the question. Given the recent tendency in some countries, including Poland, the restrict media freedoms, how are EU nations should protect free speech and media while also limiting the effect of misinformation from Russia or hostile internal forces? Sorry, it's from Chicago.
Right. Well, this is a critical question, and one that certainly the U.S. is confronting, at the same moment that Poland is as well, and is happening around the world. Look, the Major General, I think, raised some really important points here, and one perspective on this conversation. And I think there is one perspective that is that this is an extension of military adversaries' strategies to try to weaken democracies, and therefore there needs to be state-based responses, state-based intervention. Now, that makes a number of people very uncomfortable, including in the United States. The United States has a particular legal regime, built around the First Amendment, in which the opportunities that the U.S. government has for intervention into what would be referred to in this context as the information space are really very limited, and necessarily and importantly so. The criticality of preserving freedom of expression here is really key. And you're seeing major polarization on this issue at the technical level in the United States. What do I mean? Look at the conversation happening right now over, just to use one example, X, formerly Twitter, right? And should that platform be in a position to either, and it's put as really a binary condition, either allow hostile foreign governments to push misinformation on unwitting American and other citizens to advance their foreign policy aims, or should the platform be responsive to the directives of the government saying, we believe this is foreign-based misinformation and it should not be on the platform? That is the sort of Manichaean way that this debate has been described, and frankly has been playing out on that platform. Right now you have an owner of the platform that has one particular perspective on it. You have others, including in the last administration, that felt like it should very much be the opposite. Historically, part of the answer has been in the United States, and I'll just speak for the United States for a second, has been working around the edges to preserve the ability of that speech to exist while modifying either the ability of that speech to go unfettered and unchallenged, which is to say, allowing platforms to have a better opportunity and better ability at scale to label information that may or is identified with a foreign news outlet, right? If it's RTV, if we know it's coming from Sputnik, it should probably have a label attached to it, was the argument, right? So there was one sort of additional transparency and clarification components. And the more difficult one, the challenge that I think many are dealing with in the digital space right now, is this question of virality and amplification. And the First Amendment is silent on whether you have a right to speak and to be amplified co-equal with other speech, right? We're talking fundamentally in the First Amendment talking about government intervention of private speech, and X is not an instrument of the government, at least not officially. And so there's a really important distinction here that needs to be made. But at the same time, you also have the commercial incentives of these social media platforms. And I'm focusing on social media because it is the most important vector for the spread of this kind of information at this point. Their other incentive is that they don't want to be labeled as vehicles of foreign misinformation. They don't want to be junk platforms, either for political reasons or just more broadly, because that's not what people go to them to see. And so there's an interesting question of whether the commercial incentives right now are sufficient to in any way incentivize the platforms to better take action. And that includes all sorts of content illegal, or, as the case we're talking about here, problematic, unsavory, and potentially threatening to the national security of the United States, allies, partners, etc. I do think we are having a richer debate right now, an important one, about what the real contours of that are. And we have identified in the public discourse some really important areas. For instance, information that would mislead people about how and when they would vote. Information that that has to do with and pertains to political candidates in the middle of actual contested electoral contests, right? Questions of life, limb, health, safety as it would relate to emergency response. Obviously, it's terribly relevant in the case of active military operations. Things that could compromise immediate life and limb for national security concerns. You think of counterterrorism and other operations. The law and practice is developing here. And look, I'll be transparent about this, and anyone looking is aware, there has been also a very strong push to another side of this from the current administration in the United States, where J.D. Vance, when he came to Europe and had his inaugural speech at the Munich Security Conference, had some pretty strong words about what the administration's perspective is about what he deemed to be censorship, including in social media context in the political areas. And so, what I think the questioners put their finger on is a very, very live debate that has these critical dimensions. What is possible technically? And I think we need to really put a more effective problematization of what social media platforms can, should, and must do, 3 different categories in that context. And then finally, then secondly, what ultimately relates in a healthier, more effective environment to support democracies broadly. And that's a question of what role do these platforms have in civil society and in civic discourse. That's something that they should be thinking about, can be competitive differentiators. I'll tell you, my students, a lot of people, in the United States, they're kind of giving up on parts of social media. There's obviously the debate over TikTok, which we can go into, which is at the far end of this when a platform is owned by a strategic competitor and known to be a demonstrable vector of foreign misinformation, particularly on specific foreign policy areas. The U.S. government, on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, basically banned the platform. Unprecedented, completely unprecedented. And yet, speech on the platform has not stopped for a number of reasons. And there are other alternatives there. And then I think the third piece that the questioner puts their finger on, which is really critical, is this conversation needs to be had in the context of what the appropriate low watermark of allied and friend defense of common fundamental freedoms, universal values, human rights, however you want to define it, are. And those rights to free expression, whether you want to ground them in the First Amendment, when you want to ground them in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, pick your doctrinal basis. These are values that bridge the U.S. and our European partners and allies. These are values that bridge the U.S. and European peoples. These are critical differentiators between the societies that we live in and the societies that do not tolerate that sort of free expression. And so it is essential that everything we do as we're helping to pass laws that will have better technology and more effective social media communication actually be grounded back in that. And I think we've seen around the world, when it comes to a range of regimes and governments, exactly how far governments are willing to push those boundaries and willing to abuse their rights in putting their finger on it. And so those, I think, are really important parts of the conversation that we'll need to continue to carry forward.
Thank you so much. Since we don't have that much time, I will actually skip some of my questions and go to one of the latest one I wrote down. You tackled that a little bit, so systemic and societal resilience. I think that to address the complexity of emerging and often unpredictable security threats, we need to build that resilience, and to that we should also leverage emerging and disruptive technologies. So monitoring supported by sensing, surveillance technologies, AI algorithms, data embassies, as you mentioned, and so on and so forth. So we should deploy as many secure digital and technological fortress as possible while strengthening societal resilience and preparedness, I guess. But moreover, technology is also an instrument of military power. And you also explained that in the first question. So today is being used to rapidly upgrade and deploy new generation military equipment on the Ukrainian front lines, actually on both sides of the front line, as the Russians are also learning these tech lessons quite quickly. So how should we approach technology development and deployment in this hybrid era, both to enhance state level resilience and to develop a robust, agile innovation ecosystem for dual use and defense technology that meets the demand of modern hybrid and multi-domain warfare? Also, how we can do that together in collaboration between Poland and the US. There are like multilateral frameworks with NATO, Diana, but how can we support that as part of our strategic bilateral Polish-American relations and defense collaboration? That is critical. I attended today the conference with a big representation of Ukrainian military representatives during the Polish presidency. There are many conferences organized here in Krakow, and that was one of that conference. And we discuss exactly this topic, how we can collaborate with Ukraine, but how can we collaborate between Poland and US in that respect?
Right. Well, you raise a lot of great points, and this we could do this for 4 more hours to unpack all of those areas. Let's focus specifically on the lessons of the theater and then sort of build out from there. Look, when it comes to the immediate conflict in front of us, as you point out, one of the critical lessons that militaries are learning here is that the time to prepare, design, and then field and deploy is not the 10-year defense acquisition cycle that the US and NATO and our allies have become not just accustomed to, I would say, have become addicted to. And as someone who has lived their whole life in emerging technologies, in the early days of the internet up to now, the idea that our next generation anything is 7 to 10 years out in a world in which the smartest minds in AI can't tell me if we will have an AI system that is 1,000 times better than a person at everything within the next 3 years shows to me just how far we are from actually being at the edge. And yet, what we have seen is that when the need is there, when the innovation is there, when the need is existential, the amazing heroism happening on the front lines of the Ukraine are fielding tools, tool sets, software, hardware tool sets that were basically, I would go as far as to say, almost inconceivable in terms of their pace and efficacy to most conventional militaries not engaged in that conflict in the same way. And so one lesson, it has to be that let's take these lessons from the front line and what it takes to actually fight a war today against a sophisticated adversary that is going to be willing to innovate in that same way, as you point out, because this is a bilateral conflict, in the field and with obviously multilateral components. This is really got to be a wake-up call for anyone who is thinking about that interface of technology and military. To take one step back from the conflict itself, right? The countries that are helping to support what is happening on the front lines here, we have to do a better job of thinking through exactly how we can provide that support and material to the front line when it comes to these things that are potentially asymmetrically valuable, right? And I go back to 15 plus years ago when we were thinking through the early days of the NATO Cyber Alliance. And one of the greatest hangups of NATO cyber, I wrote a book chapter on this, I'm sure you've written a lot on it yourself, was the hangups of, well, some allies just weren't really comfortable sharing the contours of any potential specifics on how you might engage in a particular activity because, well, we just don't know if we trust them to have it. Well, we're talking about software that can be shipped in the blink of an eye, that can be used once, and in many cases is useless after that. And months, years were lost to that policy whinging, that sort of back and forth, that total lack of conviction behind the efficacy of the alliance in terms of its ability to deploy meaningful cyber tools. It meant we had a lost decade on cyber in NATO, I would go so far as to say. We could have made a lot more progress in terms of operational preparation, could have done a lot more progress in terms of broad operational collaboration, and importantly, we could have probably had a much more effective deterrent statement that came out as a result of that. So, relearning those lessons of 15 years ago are painful, but now we have to think about it's going to be about more than bombs and bullets that we can provide, as critical as that material is and has been. How can we start to collaborate and get our top minds thinking on the front lines virtually with those that are sitting in the warehouses, tinkering with that software on that drone to have it outsmart that particular Russian asset that we actually know something about because we've been studying it. That is different than the conventional military assistance that puts Humvees on the back and inside planes and drops them back somewhere, and it gets them just on the edge of the war zone. It's a different way of thinking about preparation for conflict. And then, I'd say the third beyond that we get a little bit even further out, is the question that you raised, which is how do we now think ahead, looking ahead to defense of our collective societies in this new technological paradigm? And it's really going to be really, really important. I'm going to hold aside this question of how do we make sure we're maintaining an innovative environment. I mean, I'm pretty convinced we can do that at the societal level. I think the question is, can we get our militaries and our alliance to adopt it fast enough? I am a huge fan of something the United States did called the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, experimental. Book came out on it. You've all probably read the book. Great. We've been talking about DIU for 10 years. Okay, an entire AI revolution has happened since DIU has come into place. National Security Capital was trying. There you go, exactly. Chris Kirkhoff, my dear friend, with whom I wrote a government strategies, and Raj Shah, another dear friend, did a great job with that. It's a book worth reading. It's also a book worth recognizing that something like that is still current in the amount of time it takes to write a book. Because again, this interface between, I know we build hardware in warfare, but we also build software. And we've got to think effectively, creatively, in ways that I think some really thoughtful people are doing right now about how we can leverage national security capital to help get over this we call valley of death, right, in building hardware bets. Because when I think about the sorts of technologies that are going to, be critical to the future, yes, of U.S. warfighting, but also, our allied economic future, what do those look like? Well, someone's going to need to have quantum supremacy. Quantum computers are very expensive. Someone's going to need to have AI supremacy. Maybe that is elusive, but nonetheless, we're going to need a lot of it. So it means we're going to need a lot of hardware. We're going to need a lot of chips. We're going to need a lot of servers. Incidentally, it also means we're going to need to not have to deny servers to our close allies, something that the diffusion rule, something came out of the US, the end of the Biden administration, has now just been reversed, created a very active debate, maybe one of the most central issues as a fissure in the US-European economic relationship of the last 6 months, 12 months, under discussed, but really important to think about. The future of building a resilient and innovative economic base that can defend societies is going to mean being very clear about sharing the best minds and technology with our allies and partners, and then putting up the right fences to ensure that there isn't diffusion of that technology out to our adversaries. And things that get in the middle of that, it strikes me, waste a lot of brain power, a lot of paper, and most importantly, a lot of time. And time is what we don't have in the context of these sorts of areas. And I think the people that are most equipped to talk about that, the ones that should be on this panel instead of me, are the folks that are working in collaborative cyber defense. The Major General talked about some of these folks, right? The ones that are actually day in and day out fielding, plugging these putting these patches in this software, plugging these holes in these firmware systems, identifying what's being exploited in our multi-billion-dollar military hardware kit so that they don't become giant, expensive paperweights. There are people, heroic people on the front lines and behind that are day in and day out, literally like reverse hackers sitting and pushing these lines of code. They are as critical to the future of resilience of these societies as anyone else. And I would argue times at which we are cutting in times of difficult budgets or the apparent political imperative of budget crises, cutting personnel that do this, that's very dangerous because they never have too many people that are working on resilience or defense, particularly in the cyber context. This area is moving fast. It needs more talented, trained individuals. And the more we as US, Poland, allies among NATO can start to share that expertise and to enhance the way that we develop it, I hope that it starts to look a lot more like it does at MIT, which is to say MIT is a place that, like many other universities, has fantastic expertise from great minds that have come from, among other places, Poland and Europe, that are interested in studying in the United States for a different perspective, interested in contributing at the faculty level. That is the reality of the forefront of computer science. It is not one country that is doing this. And so I think the other lesson, the big picture lesson to pull all the way out, is that because of our shared values, because of our shared history, because of our shared technological base, we have the opportunity to jointly innovate here going forward, and we would throw that away at our own peril.
Thank you so much, David. Yes, shared history remind me about Enigma decryption, and in fact, those classified information were the backrock for Five Eyes allies. So yes, looking in the history, let's think about the future. Actually, Poland and Europe are now going through this Unit X revolution. I would say there is a space also to share best practices between Poland and the US. So I'm also looking for that in upcoming months. Thank you very much. I know that we are now run out of the time. So back to Igor. Thank you so much, David. In fact, we could probably discuss that topic for much more time, but unfortunately not today.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for joining.
Thank you.
In fact, we'd be happy to listen to you at least one more hour, but maybe next time. Thank you, Isa, so much for excellent
Igor.
Leading the discussion. Thank you to David, and thank you to General Molenda.